stories for you. I am your host, Adesoji Iginla, and with me, as always, is journalist, publisher, Black Star News, broadcaster, WBAI.org, 99.5 FM, New York Radio, that is. He teaches African history at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. He holds degrees in journalism and economics from Columbia University and Syracuse University, respectively. His book, Manufacturing Hate, How Africa Was Demonized in the Western Media, inspired African News Review. And should I also mention that in his spare time, he's also an explorer and is given one of Europe's remarkable rivers, London's main river, that is, the name River Gulu. I speak of none other than Comrade Milton Allimadi. Welcome, and how have you been?
My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you, brother.
Yes. So this week we have a series of stories lined up for you. But before we do that, we should give honor to an African, a Pan-Africanist, a writer, essayist, a playwright, and a general international icon. I speak no other than of Professor Wole Soyinka, who today turned 90. And
wow. Bless him.
You were going to say?
I said, bless the brother.
Yes, bless the brother. Yes. May his days be long. I mean, he has done enough to keep us reading for the next century. A few of his books, I particularly love essays. So I've got Art, Dialogue, and Outrage, which is that. And I encourage people to actually get that. Speaking of his plays, it's Wole Soyinka collected plays, The Lion and the Jewel, Kongi Harvest, The Trial of Brother Jero, Jero Metamorphosis, Madmen and Specialist. And his most recent work is Chronicles from the Land of the Happiest People on Earth. It's a novel, and it speaks to the sort of things we're able to embrace as Africans, you know, not knowing who we are and the kind of things we put up with. But there is one particular book I will actually ask people to go out and try and get. Ngugo Ationgo did something similar in Decolonizing the Mind. He wrote Myth, Literature, and the African World by Wole Soyinka, a series of essays where he breaks down how Western academia has been used to supplant the story of Africa and what we can do to regain our agency. And so, once again, it's happy 90th birthday, and may his days be long, as they would say.
Ashe.
Yeah. So, speaking of Africa, we go to the West Africa, and the first paper we're starting with is The Economist. With The Economist, Economics has decided, you know what, we are going to toss off the gloves and punch right back at Africans. And by that, it said, meet the victors in Africa coup belt. They are militaristic, nationalistic, and keen to cut a deal. Talk about undermining one. The West relations with countries in the Sahel seem to have hit rock bottom in May when Niger ordered America to withdraw its forces by September, having already booted out a French counter-terrorism mission and welcomed Russian advisors. Then even this bottom fell out. Last month, Niger, which supplies about a quarter of Europe's uranium, revoked the mining license of France's state-owned nuclear fuel company. Many fear the country will now hand over those rights of one of the biggest uranium mines to a state-owned Russian firm. You can see where this story is going. Niger turns against the West comes amidst what many in French-speaking West Africa are calling a second independence. It is being spurred by a new generation of nationalists who have taken over in former French colonies from Niger to Chad and the three core countries of the Sahel, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, have done so amid strident appeals to sovereignty and autonomy in language reminiscent of Ahmed Sékou Touré, independent Guinea's first president, who told Charles de Gaulle in 1958, Guinea prefers poverty in liberty to riches in slavery. Several have strengthened ties with Russia. All want a new relationship with the West. Sovereignty is the big word in these regions these days, says Ibrahim Yahya of Crisis Group, a Brussels-based think tank. It has become almost like a religious dogma. What are your first assessments, comrade?
Well, I mean, obviously, the most interesting part so far is the reference to sovereignty.
Okay.
As if there's any surprise there, as if they're saying something which is absurd, right? It's become like dogma. It should, right? Because which African country really enjoys sovereignty?
True.
That's the question that our listeners should ask themselves. Which African country enjoys sovereignty? Which African country determines its own destiny? You know, if your budget is pretty much set by the World Bank, how can you say you're a sovereign, independent country? You know?
Good question.
That's
Good
the bottom
question.
line. That's where to start. You know, the World Bank gives you money, and they say this is how much you should spend on A, on B, on which sector. This is how much you spend on education. This is how much you spend on healthcare. This is how much you spend on subsidizing transport, you know, fuel. So how much you spend on subsidizing food in the urban areas where people cannot grow their own food. And yet you call yourself an independent African country.
The absurdity of the statement.
Exactly. You have a fictitious president or prime minister. You have fictitious ministers who zoom around with Mercedes Benz and all these armed escorts, you know, as if they're really important, right? They're important in their minds only. But they are obviously they exude this importance, self-importance to the suffering masses. That is why Sankara asked, he said, what justification do I have to have a high salary when my people are impoverished? And the first thing he did was he cut salary, including his as head of state, and then of all the ministers. Why are we driving all these expensive cars when our people are either walking or riding a bicycle? Let's take these economy-sized cars and let's share the vehicles, right?
Yeah.
But most important, he mobilized the population of this country. He got them involved in national affairs, and that's the beginning of sovereignty. He got them to grow their own food. They're not dependent on food imports. Self-sufficiency, that is independent. So none of these countries really are sovereign states. I'm glad they're talking like that. Obviously, we need every African country to be talking like that.
True.
And this is sovereignty. They don't just want sovereignty for the sake of some esoteric or philosophical reason. They want to control their resources. And that is why the article is also discussing the uranium factor. You know, if we exercise control over every piece of resource, every inch of land on our African beloved continent, that is beginning of sovereignty. China is a sovereign country.
Very much so.
Know?
Very much so.
China does not have any foreign troops based in China, right?
Yep.
China determines its own budget. And that is why China is on its way to supersede most of the Western countries, including the United States. Because by determining its own budget, It is investing in education
First
and
and
research
foremost.
and technology, you see,
Yeah.
and transforming the country. So now you have an African country, and a Western institution is going to tell you how much you can invest in education when the value of every society is the level of preparedness of each
In
and
the
every one of its
cities.
citizens, right?
Correct. Correct.
Why was Cuba transformed over a short period of time? Education, and not just education, the correct form of
Education.
education and orientation, right? Why was China transformed? Education. Before the revolution, education was maybe 13, 14%. Literacy. Now, literacy is one of the highest in the world, 90+%. You know, the same thing in Cuba. And yet they don't want us to do these things in Africa.
So there is another part in there that I think we should also focus on.
Yes.
And it's here where Western forces have been helping the previous government battle jihadists linked to Islamic State and Al Qaeda. The wider group, including Bassirou Diomaye Faye, Senegalese newly elected president, and Lieutenant Colonel Mamadi Doumbouya. Since like he said, the era of the old Africa is over. But can we focus on this part where he says where the Western forces have been helping the previous governments battle jihadis linked to...
You know?
Go on.
That's a complete lie. Either they're complicit in the destabilizing insurgency, or they're totally militarily incompetent. The insurgencies started not by accident in 2010, 2011, after NATO destroyed Muammar Gaddafi's government in Libya, and all those arms proliferated throughout the region. So you're telling me that with their so-called sophisticated armed forces and weapons, they are not able to control this in 10 years? We're talking 12, 13 years now. So who are they helping? What kind of help is that? Now, what kind of help is that? That is 13 years and you're going nowhere, right?
Correct.
So I don't buy that at all. That's just propaganda. That's propaganda to say somehow the regimes that was replaced with the new governments, and that these new governments are less capable of dealing with the insurgencies.
Fact.
Well, what did you do in 13 years? The insurgency should not be there if you're really there to help. I've always believed in analysts who say that they really didn't want the insurgencies to be defeated, because that would then, what rationale would they still have to keep Western troops in that part of the world?
That's a correct assessment. That's a brilliant assessment. That's a brilliant assessment.
Because then those governments will not be dependent. And in fact, if people do research, they'll see that most of these governments have been complaining. You know, in Mali, they went to the extent of saying there was complicity between the French military and some of these insurgencies, you know, allowing them to operate in some areas to keep the government on its heel, and the government keep it dependent and not being able to dare to ask these troops to leave the country.
To leave the country.
So it's really sad. It's a tragedy. But at the end of the day, they bear not only moral responsibility, of course, they actually bear liability by destroying the government in Libya. And this is a consequence that anybody could have predicted would result. And it's only allowed to happen, you know, in an African setting. You know, let's go destroy a government, unleash all these weapons, and then walk away, and then blame these countries that are trying to resist the insurgency.
Correct.
Look, they're kicking us out. So they must not be serious in fighting this insurgency. So we have to connect all these pieces together. As I say, they write truths, but they write half truths.
Yeah.
They start stories at a particular instance in the narrative. And if you don't draw what is missing, then you'll become confused.
I'll take one last part here. The new nationalists portray themselves as the modern embodiment of the anti-colonial struggle. Colonel Dumbaye has set about rehabilitating the divisive memory of Sékou Touré. Hold that thought. For instance, by renaming Conakry's airport after him. Burkina Faso's 36-year-old Captain Ibrahim Traoré, who grabbed the presidency in a Porsche in 2022, styles himself as the reincarnation of Thomas Sankara, a socialist leader who was assassinated in 1987. What do you say to that?
Well, obviously, I noticed that they didn't really say that Sankara was divisive. Touré was divisive because, unlike Houphouët-Boigny, he did not say, yes, we want to continue being a French colony.
Yeah.
He said no. He said yes to independence, no to continued colonialism. So that qualifies him as divisive automatically. But Sankara becomes divisive by linking him in the same sentence with Sékou Touré, who's already been referred to as divisive. So you see the tactics here.
Yes,
guilty they're too clever for their own good, and then if you go to their countries, they have all these monuments and statues celebrating slavers, enslavers, imperialists, colonialists, people that engage in ethnic cleansing in Africa and other parts of the world, but yet you are not allowed to celebrate any of your ancestors, That's nonsense, of course. We need to write our own history. We need to determine who are our own idols and who are our own heroes. But we must read their narratives and their literature in order for us to be able to defend ourselves properly. You must know what they're saying. So that's why I'm a big fan of reading their media, their newspapers and their books.
The reason I highlighted that particular bit was the fact that, just like you said, the divisive memory of Sékou Touré. When Sékou Touré said we prefer poverty in independence as opposed to riches in slavery, what he was effectively saying is, just like you said, Houphouët-Boigny was the gentleman in Senegal. Leopold Senghor. Yeah, Leopold Senghor. We are not going to be like them. We are going to craft our own path. What did France do to Guinea? Basically destroy their infrastructure so that, to send a message to anybody else that might be thinking of towing the same path. Correct. And in this last final paragraph, they said, Thomas Sankara, a socialist leader who was assassinated in 1987. We're in the month of July 15th of 1987. He delivered that speech on the floor of the OAU. And by October 15th of the same year, he was dead. And what was he talking about?
Foreign debt, of course.
Thank you very much.
But then, in passing, as if France had nothing to do with the assassination. Who was assassinated. And then that's it.
A passive sentence.
With no context, So the implication is that he was assassinated because he was a socialist, you see?
Yeah.
It's amazing.
No, I mean, when you read these newspapers or magazines or listen to the radio, the reason why programs like this is very important is you need to be able to read in between the lines.
Absolutely. You have to decode. In other words, we
Yes.
need a dictionary.
Hmm.
And that's what we serve. We serve our role. We are a dictionary
Hmm.
for understanding Western media.
Which
Without a
is
dictionary, you cannot understand what you're reading, really. It's like you're reading listening to a foreign language or reading a foreign language, which is what it is actually. You think you know it, but then you realize that you actually don't know it,
hmm.
you know.
Hmm. And to go into our next story, still in line with the Sahel, is our friends have decided, the military leaders in Burkina Faso have decided they are not returning to ECOWAS. For those of us just joining, ECOWAS is the Economic Community of West African States. It's a regional bloc that covers 16 countries in West Africa. So we go in, and this story comes from the Associated Press, and we read Niamey, AP. Military junta leaders of Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso on Saturday ruled out returning their nations to the West African regional bloc, whose division could further jeopardize efforts to undo coups and curb violence spreading across the region. Okay. The leaders of the three countries announced that position during their first summit in Niamey, the capital of Niger, after their withdrawal from the West African bloc known as ECOWAS in January. They accused the bloc of failing its mandate and pledged to consolidate their own union, the Alliance of Sahel States, created last year amid fractured relationship with neighbors. The nearly 50-year-old ECOWAS had become a threat to our states, said Niger's military leader, General Abdurrahman Tiani. We are going to create an AES of the people instead of an ECOWAS whose directives and instructions are dictated to it by powers that are foreign to Africa. The meeting of the three countries that border one another came a day before an ECOWAS summit being held in Nigeria by other heads of states in the region. So, what would you say to this? Is this a healthy development, or we should just wait and see?
No, it's a healthy, regardless of what the ultimate outcome is. It's
Okay.
healthy in the sense that it suggests the direction that African countries need to take.
Mm,
At the end of the day, in order to exercise sovereignty and control over your resources, we need to be powerful. Individually, separated, divided, as Nkrumah, they used to prefer the word balkanized, we are weak as
mm,
individual countries.
mm.
But as a collective, we are powerful. A continent of more than 1.3 billion people. And yet, we don't exercise any significant impact
Control.
on global affairs. Just think about it. How can tiny Israel have more impact than a continent of 1.3 billion people? You
Mm,
see, even when South Africa intervened on the global stage without lawsuit, it was good for two reasons. Number one, it was good. It showed that an African state pursuing the correct policy at the right time can have significant worldwide impact.
yeah,
Number one. Number two, it shows also the vulnerability because you saw the attack against South Africa
of
in the
course.
US Congress. They were introducing a bill to punish South Africa.
That, yeah.
Can you believe that? For exercising its sovereignty. And of course, what South Africa started has unleashed significant progress in terms of the pressure against Israel's militaristic and genocidal war against Gaza.
Mm,
Many more countries became much more adamant in their condemnation of this conflict. In fact, ultimately, as you know, uh, the uh, the statement by the chief prosecutor at the International Criminal Court, the ICC. I don't believe that would have materialized had it not been for the mood change that was generated by the lawsuit by South Africa at the International Court of Justice, ICJ, which of course is a separate court, both of them, and The Hague. But this just shows you how what impact the correct policy can materialize and effectuate. But at the same time, it shows you that in order for us to resist any retaliation when we take those kind of decisions, we need to be stronger. And we can only gain that by uniting. As even when it comes to economic impact, as the late Job once said, we cannot put the cart ahead of the horse.
Yeah.
We need these political units to come together to form larger executive bodies that make the same coordinated executive position. And that's how we can really become powerful economically as well. So, in fact, by them, even before they formed the formal alliance of the Sahel states, they had already had impact on ECOWAS by making a statement. Remember, they made a statement that any attack on any one of those three countries, they would consider an attack on any one of them, right? Collectively.
True.
And that statement, and then coordinating politically and militarily, ECOWAS and France, which of course was dictating these things in the background, realized that there was no way they could invade Niger.
Yeah.
Remember, they had given, I think it was a 2-week deadline.
Yeah, 2 weeks deadline. Then it was
to
extended to a
the
month.
Political change.
Yep.
Right. They backed off. That imposed all those sanctions. They backed off on those sanctions. So they're already having impact. And now, by refusing to return to the fold, it will have additional impact, including, number one, it would continue to put more pressure on ECOWAS to make even more concessions to their position. Number one. Number two, of course, it would make these other countries see that new alliance as a potential alternative to ECOWAS.
Yep.
And whether the current governments in some of these other countries are drawn toward wanting to even join this new alliance, or whether a future leadership, which is still in waiting in these countries, which will be much more representative of the desires of the youth population in these countries, they might also want to consider even joining this new union. So at the end of the day, it's going to change ECOWAS as we know it. ECOWAS will have to change if it wants to survive. ECOWAS will have to embrace some of the sentiments that are driving these three countries. And perhaps sometime in the future, these concepts can be integrated into a new ECOWAS, or ECOWAS will risk becoming irrelevant. And this new alliance could continue to grow.
And it's funny that those three should actually come up and say this is their position on things. Because when ECOWAS itself was formed, according to the Lagos Accord, it was at the insistence of two military generals, Yasigbe Eyadema of Togo and Yakubu Gowon of Nigeria, May 25, 1975. Now, the problem is, in the initial accord was the line non-interference in the affairs of member states.
Correct.
But fast forward to the early 2000s with the insistence of staying in power of, what's his name? Yahya Jammeh of Gambia.
Correct.
That was when the issue of, quote unquote, interference in the member states came up for discussion, He was given an ultimatum, eventually was pushed out. Now, that then went back to the back burner. But with the rise of the independent-minded West Africans seeking to expel France, France is now using its influence in the region to use the might of Nigeria, which is rather unfortunate, to lean on the countries wherein before it was a question of Nigeria should not interfere in the affairs of countries like Cote d'Ivoire, especially all those Francophone speaking countries. So it's a question of, maybe the organization is no longer fit for purpose. Maybe, like you said, the coming together of these three countries with the AES might just be the kick that ECOWAS needs in order to chain tag and, become more relevant in the 21st century.
Right. What they're doing is what Thomas Sankara was trying to do. Unfortunately, he was alone. People loved what he was doing, but nobody was willing to step up on the podium with him. And he captured that brilliantly in that same speech that you referred to in July 1987 at the Organization of African
Unity
Union meeting in Addis Ababa. That's before it was superseded by the African Union. And he said, in terms of the debt burden, we all need to have the debt council so we can use our resources to build our countries.
Facts.
But if I declare alone that Burkina Faso is going to renounce the debt, I will not be alive to attend next year's conference. And as you said, 3 months later, he was dead in October. So now, and they remember the words he said. Sankara said, they cannot assassinate 54 African presidents. He said it. Anybody can go and listen to that speech. It's on YouTube. It's on French. It's in French, but it has English subtitles.
Yeah.
So these three actually saying they cannot assassinate 3 heads of state.
Heads of state, yeah.
And it's not so much that they cannot, but the cost is very high. If you do that, then it's quite obvious that it can't be a coincidence, Although, I'm telling you, imperialism is capable of doing the most amazing thing. Think about it. To go to Libya, which had the highest per capita income in African countries, had the most impressive educational and social and healthcare services for its citizens. They went there, they destroyed the entire infrastructure, and they killed the head of state. So I'm not saying it's impossible to them. So that's why it's important that these 3 heads of state, obviously when they travel, they can never be traveling together because that would make them an easy target, as you know.
True.
What do they say? 1 bird or 3 birds in this case with 1 stone. So they obviously still have to be very careful in terms of being together at the same time. Yeah. All right? Imperialism is not incapable of doing the most amazing things. But obviously, it's much more problematic to get rid of 3 heads of state than it is to get rid of 1 head of state, which was in the case of Thomas Sankara. And they're hoping that at least this is how I see it, that if they take the kind of position they're taking now, there would be more heads of state who would be willing to join this alliance and make it even much more difficult for them to be eliminated and make it much more possible that they can succeed in the agenda that they want to implement in their countries.
Speaking of problematic, we go to East Africa and we go to Kenya. Kenya has again been in the news, and this time the news comes from the New York Times, and it says, after deadly protests, Kenyan tell of brutal abductions. 1 activist was taken while organizing a blood drive for wounded protesters. Another said he was snatched as he walked home after dark, after midnight. His wife and 3 children sleeping nearby. A third said he was beaten and blindfolded before being tossed into the trunk of a car. All of them said they were set up by government security forces in Kenya over the past 2 weeks after they had spoken out against a contentious bill to raise taxes in the cash-strapped East African nation. They told of how armed men in balaclavas and unmarked cars yanked them from the streets or their homes in the middle of the night, blindfolded them and beat them and interrogated them about their involvement in the protest. A few of those seized are still missing, lawyers said. The disappearance has rattled Kenya, a long-standing anchor of stability in the Horn of Africa. Activists said the disappearance have left an indelible stain on the government of President William Ruto, a key Western ally who was feted by President Biden in May as Kenya was designated a major African security partner. During a live discussion with Kenyan on social media site X on Friday, Mr. Ruto was confronted by a political activist who said officers had beaten him, stolen from his house, and then whisked him to an unknown location. The president replying, "If that is the kind of treatment you have gone through, I apologize," Mr. Ruto said. "It is not right." The president also said he promised to investigate a new problem called abduction and ensure that police follow legal procedures when making arrests. I don't even know
Okay.
what to say.
Well, actually, I have quite a few things to say about this
Okay,
article.
go on.
And it's very disingenuous on many levels.
Oh,
Um, I like the fact that obviously the article was done, but the article is missing many key elements. But before I get into those elements, I want to say that Kenya is actually at a relatively decent spot now. And that comes with the kind of scrutiny that President William Ruto is now under and the Kenyan government. And of course, part of that is related to, as the author says, being feted at the White House. Because now you've been welcomed into the house. So you're expected to abide by certain behavior of people that have been welcomed into the house. You're not welcome as an individual per se.
true.
You know, you're welcome as Kenya, right?
Okay.
So Kenya gets a little bit of a different treatment now that you've been a guest, and pun totally intended, a guest in the White House, right?
Yeah.
So you can't go back to being same old Kenya. So Ruto is going to be very sensitive to the media expose of these type of atrocities, because he knows that Kenya is now going to be looked at much more closely. It's considered now to be a country that's associated with certain norms and certain behaviors. And to put it crudely, it's not expected to be the so-called quote unquote typical African country. Let's put it, that's how they observe it. So I'm just speaking in plain language.
Okay.
So that's why Ruto is expressing his remorse and all that. Okay, so that's the one level I wanted to comment on. And here's the second level. Abdi Latif Tahir, who is the New York Times correspondent, has written the same story before.
Oh.
About these abductions, people being abducted in unmarked vehicles, people being taken away and beaten or tortured. So you can take everything he wrote here verbatim and replace Kenya with Uganda. He has
Oh.
written about this type of an abduction many times. So that's why I say there's an element of disingenuousness here. Because unless it was edited out and he had it in his original story. And I respect him because he has done much better journalism in the past. So my own view is that what I'm about to say was probably edited out,
Mm-hmm.
or perhaps he now knows the way the foreign desk is editing, so he decided to edit it out himself. But something, it was edited out by somebody. It was edited out after it was written, or was edited out by not being written about at all. He has, and I want people to Google Abdi Latif Dahir. His first name is Abdi,
Mm-hmm.
Abdi, middle name Latif, Latif, last name Dahar, who is the author of this story in the New York Times. He's a New York Times correspondent in East Central Africa, based in Nairobi. So put his name in Google and then put abductions and then put Uganda. And you'll see many articles very similar to this. So how is it that a an experienced journalist can write something like this and not even mention that this bears identical resemblance to what is going on in Uganda? And then in Uganda, people refer to it as drones. When government agents come in civilian outfit with unmarked vehicles and they kidnap people sometimes when they're having lunch, or just kidnap them in the middle of the street, or come to their homes at night and snatch them, as is being discussed in this article. How can you not mention the obvious correlation? Because a lot of the conversation on social media is that because Ruto is very close to Ugandan dictator Yoweri Museveni, a lot of the conversation on social media is that Museveni's intelligence folks were coordinating some of these activity with Kenyan security. Oh. It bears all the fingerprints of Ugandan, what's been going on in Uganda since before the 2021 election. So that's why I say it's completely disingenuous not to bring that reference up in this article. But I'm glad at least that he's focusing our attention on this
interesting.
What's going on in Kenya.
Interesting.
And of course, if you just read it without knowing the context, it would not even occur to you to cross your mind that, wait a minute, this is happening right next to Uganda. You know, I only know it because obviously I'm from Uganda and I follow very, very closely. You know, so that's actually despicable for journalism, and I hope he does not repeat it in the future.
Oh, I'm sure he's been warned. Okay, I'll end with this part of it. It says, for many Kenyans, the latest abductions recall the authoritarian rule of Daniel Arap Moi, whose 24 years in power from 1978 to 2002 were marred by corruption and the abduction of opponents, torture, and extrajudicial killings. A dangerous precedent has been set Fet Ohambo, the president of the Law Society of Kenya, an umbrella lawyer organization working to release protesters. The president wants to rule, and he wants to rule with fear.
Right. So this is echoing exactly what I just said by bringing that reference to Moi. But you don't need to go back that far in history. Just look next door at your neighboring country. In fact, this is where I'm willing to speculate this. I'm willing to speculate that one of the many people interviewed said, we are turning into Uganda, or we are just like Uganda, because it's so obvious. There are many Kenyans on social media who are saying that. So I find it difficult that of all the people interviewed for this article in the New York Times, not one of them said that.
Let's see. Let's scroll down. There are 8 pages of it, where in the 5th page, there is none. There is none. There is no reference to Uganda at all.
Yeah, that's disingenuous. That's not fair. That's not good journalism. As I
Okay.
said, it was either there or removed, or it was preempted by the writer who knows that my editors don't want to see this. Either way, it should be corrected in future articles.
Mm, mm.
You know?
Wow, interesting. That
Yes.
is truly interesting.
Yes.
Oh, and okay, from East Africa we go out into the ocean, and we go to Diego Garcia. And Diego Garcia is very interesting. And the story comes from the BBC. So the BBC World Service. Uh, the story leads with US blocks British court from British territory. And that is Diego Garcia. More on that later. The US government has blocked a British court from hearing from a court, well, blocked a British court hearing from taking place on a British territory, citing security concerns, according to official documents. The Supreme Court of the British Indian Ocean Territory was due to hold a hearing this week, attended by the BBC, on whether a group of migrants were being unlawfully detained on the island of Diego Garcia. The island hosts a secretive UK-US military base, and access is heavily restricted. The US last week said it was withdrawing its consent from lawyers representing the migrants and the members of the press, the BBC, to access the island, according to official communications we have seen. It said it would not allow participants of the hearing to board US military flights to Diego Garcia and would not provide housing, transportation, and food for the visits. The US said it is willing to reconsider if the visit was conducted in a manner that addressed its security and operational concern. For those who are wondering where Diego Garcia is literally bang next to Mauritius, which is Africa. So, and the security concerns relate to the site-state visit, which has been scheduled to take place on the island as part of the hearing, which was to include the migrant camp and several other areas of Diego Garcia. What is your initial take before I even? This is just
My initial take
Hmm.
is, how is British territory in the Indian Ocean 2,000 miles away from the African coastline? How is that possibly
Hmm.
British territory?
Hmm.
You know? So this is imperialism at its best on display. This reminds me of the so-called Boer War
Mm-hmm.
in South Africa at the turn of the uh, 20th century, the end of the 19th century, when, of course, South Africa was occupied by Dutch and by British Europeans who seized the land
Hmm.
and then eventually started seizing the mineral resources. So after there was a major discovery of gold and diamonds, so you had the British and the Dutch fighting and killing each other in South Africa over something that didn't belong to them. And in fact, this was when the British first put to major test the system of concentration camps, right?
Yep.
When they confined the Dutch in concentration camps and killed almost 30,000 of fellow Europeans.
On
And
the
this all
continent of
to
Africa.
see who ends up controlling the gold and diamond in South Africa. So now you have the United States making policy or taking action over land that is allegedly British. Even though the closest territory African territories,
Correct. Correct.
So that to me is my first initial impression before you go any further, as you asked.
Okay. Now, Diego Garcia, for those who don't know, actually is a name that was given to it post 1972. The initial name of the island is called Chaguan Island.
Right.
And what transpired there is a case of settler colonialism with a military face. What happened? The US wanted the territory. The territory at the time was next to Mauritius. Mauritius, by being a colony of the United Kingdom, they took everybody off the island and gassed animals and what have you into a pit, concrete the place over, renamed the place Diego Garcia. The UK took control of the Chaguan Islands, of which Diego Garcia is part, from its then colony Mauritius in 1965. It went on to evict its population of more than 1,000 to make way for the military base. Agreements, like you said, were signed, which allowed for an initial 50-year period of US use of the territory, plus a further 20 years, making a total of 70 years. The agreement was then rolled over in 2016, and is now set to expire in 2036. Now, there has been a series of cases challenging the situation. The last being recently in the United Kingdom, where a judge said, although we agree that the government should return the land, but the hands of the court are effectually tied. The UN did pass a resolution, and the resolution says the land should be returned, to which you all know what will happen next. He falls on deaf ears. So this is a classic case of 1,000 people who have lost their heritage. Their land was concrete over. We're talking about land that have hosted them for hundreds of years. Their loved ones were buried there. Their life is there. Some of them are now refugees in Mauritius and Seychelles. There are a couple of them in London, but still, it's just the nature of how people go in to other people's places, upstage the population. I mean, one would say this pales in comparison to what was done to them.
If they had their way, they would have exterminated all of them. You see?
That was what I was going to next.
Right. They didn't succeed. That's why we're discussing it today.
Yeah.
And that's why we need more people to take interest and don't just say, oh, this is a faraway place.
Yeah.
With a very tiny population. No, everybody has the right to sovereignty.
Yeah.
And to determine their own affairs. You can't say because it's a tiny place. Look at tiny Grenada.
Yep.
Right? A population of, at the time, Maurice Bishop was there, maybe around 80,000.
Yep.
Right? If that even, maybe even less, because today I think it's around 125,000. Yet, look at the impact it had in inspiring people around the world in terms of the social transformation and revolution that Maurice Bishop and his New Jewel movement was trying to put in place in Grenada. The United States felt threatened by that. And obviously, when there was a power struggle in 1983, and Bishop was killed by a faction that was controlled by his deputy at that time, that gave the United States the excuse that it wanted to invade the country and claim that it was going there to protect U.S. citizens. So the size, look at what Thomas Sankara was accomplishing in tiny Burkina Faso.
Yeah.
It had global impact, right? So we don't know if there's another Maurice Bishop, there's a Thomas Sankara, somewhere there in what they're referring to now is Diego Garcia.
Hmm.
So they have their rights and they must get their rights back.
Hopefully. And on that very reflective note, we've come to the end of this week's episode of African News Review. And any final words, sir?
Well, I must say that one of the most empowering things is to feel that you're empowering others,
Mm.
you know? And so I want people that listen to us not just say, oh, I'm going to come back next week, right? I want you to do two things. When you come back next week, come with somebody else.
Yep.
And I hope at some point we'll have occasion to make it interactive, that we'll be able to have live interaction with conversation with some of them and even take questions, number one.
Yep. Yep.
But here's the most important thing. I want them to take this practice and start analyzing and critiquing with other people in their own settings. You don't even have to join us. But this is a skill that every African must have. And that will allow us to decolonize mentally. What's been holding us back a lot is the mental colonization.
Hmm.
That's one of the most successful things that imperialism and colonialism accomplished against African people, not only on the African continent, but globally. Globally, there's still too many Africans who think they are somehow second class to others, right?
Hmm.
They think somehow non-Europeans are intellectually inferior to Europeans because that's how they've been taught historically. And the messaging is still the same thing, whether in advertising, whether in
Movies.
whether in the symbols of development. So when we see automobiles, when we see airplanes, we see computers, we see smartphones, and then we see that all these things we as African people import from outside Africa.
Yep.
So we are not able to produce these things. So we must be intellectually inferior, which is, of course, nonsense. Number one, no other people anywhere built the kind of culture that we see in Kemet, ancient Egypt. If the pyramids were built by non-Africans, they would have built it in the places from where they came from. Correct?
Facts.
Charity begins at home. So they would have built it there and then come to build it in Africa. So that never happened. So it was built by Africans, right? So obviously, and it's not surprising that we are the home of humanity. So of course, we cannot be intellectually inferior to anybody since we gave birth to everybody else.
True.
Number one. Number two, and this is much more basic. China has proven that this is nonsense, right?
Correct.
China was a dependent country before the revolution. China did not become a manufacturing powerhouse until the last few decades. Now China builds planes, ships, automobiles, computers, smartphones. In fact, now all these Western countries are shifting the construction to China, the manufacturing, right? And then importing. So if China can do it, whereas it never did it before, it means we can do it too.
True.
But we need to do a couple of things. We need to unite so we control our resources, and then we can demand fair value for our resources, and then we can build the factories we need, and then we'll build these things. And that will also dispel that sense of inferiority
complex. Yeah. Yes.
So those are my closing words.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And as always, we show our appreciations. Thank you for your insights. Again, just
Thank
like
you.
Brother Milton said, pick up a newspaper, a book, anything. Look at it critically, analyze it with somebody else,
Yeah,
and share your thoughts. That's how you demystify things that are around you. And then you're not clouded by whatever is put first before you under the auspices of advancement of thought or whatever. I mean, there's a reason why things are called myths. Sometimes they're not backed by anything other than the fact that a group of people want to tell you a story and they want you to hold true to said story.
yeah,
And we have our own fables. The old English African proverb is, for long the story of the hunt has glorified the hunters. Now the lions want to tell their own stories. And that is what we're trying to do here, one story at a time. One story at a time.
exactly.
So thank you all for joining us. And until next week, it is
A
good
luta
night from me.
continua.
Good night.